Captain Deane's Treasure. Written and read by Christopher Halton. Across the misty and forlorn marshes of Sandalford, in the county of Lancashire, a ghostly echo of a church bell is sometimes chimed late into the night, and often on a full moon, where sometimes it is observed by wildfowlers and fishermen, the presence of a rowing boat crewed by tricorn-hatted men, whose silhouettes painted by moonlight silently drift to shore before fading away into the ether. It is claimed that these spiritual shades were the survivors of a brigantine pirate ship called the Terror. This formidable boat, armed with 10 cannons and crewed by 100 men, attacked, boarded and sunk merchant ships sailing from the New World to their home ports laden with gold, silver and spices. Their captain, a nefariously cruel character called William Deane, was one of only 6 survivors following a cannon duel with 2 Royal Navy cutters that pounded her to oblivion off the Sandalford coast, sending her and most of the crew to a well-deserved watery grave. The ghostly echoes of the church bell are believed to be the restless spirits of these unfortunate men, forever haunting the marshes where their ship met its end. Apparently, a king's ransom of precious gold the Spanish looted from the Incas was on that sole surviving boat, and like the 6 men, it was never seen again. Harmon de Marquis, An Antiquary of Ghosts, published 1815. In August 1922, on a summer break from university, Harry Holden, a young man in his early 20s, arrived in Sandalford, a small port on a tributary of the Sandwell River. Harry was a tall, lean and scholarly man whose eyes were filled with fascination as he arrived at the quaint charm of old Sandalford village. Besides the 15th century Mariner's Rest pub, where he had booked a room for a week, there were only a few buildings, including a row of 17th century clapperboard fishermen's cottages, a grocer, a butcher, a vicarage, a church and a cemetery. The total population being around 40 souls. The wharf and quay offered pleasant views towards the estuary, where a few fishing boats and sailing skiffs were moored. Sandalford was a private haven, little explored even by the then growing tourism market. The only sounds were the screech of gulls following the landing of fish, and the occasional bark of a dog. The sight of old fishermen with big bushy beards, who were busy weaving repairs to a large fishing net, and 2 small dogs frolicking nearby completed the scene. Harry felt the peace and contentment he needed after 2 years of intense study towards a degree in archaeology. He sauntered to the pub, where he was to be greeted by the publican's wife, Mrs. Audrey German, a large and jolly lady in her 50s, with curly auburn hair and rosy red cheeks. Mrs. German, wearing a large apron over a red polka-dotted dress, was busy hanging clothes to dry in the pub garden. She was deep in thought and quite unaware that Harry had quietly wandered in, so he coughed a little, which caused her to look around quickly and say in surprise, "How can I help you, young sir? Oh, you quite made me jump." He apologized and said, "Harry Holden, ma'am, you must be Mrs. German, yes? I booked a week here for a break from university life and phoned you last week." She smiled. "Yes, of course, how silly of me. My mind was on the housework. If you follow me, Mr. Holden, I will take you to your room." They went inside through the rear entrance, and she stopped at a key cabinet behind the bar on the way to the staircase, and withdrew 2 keys. "One is your room, sir, and the other is the back door key if it's late, but be quiet, mind you. Arthur, my husband has to be up early in the morning." Eventually, at the top of the staircase, she opened one of 6 doors on the landing and said, "Here you are, sir, and with a fine view over the Sandalford marshes. But you don't want to be wandering in there, as it can be quite dangerous with the soft mud." The room, adorned with a heavily beamed ceiling, had a small single bed, a washstand and a mahogany wardrobe. It had an attractive view of a flat marsh, extending a mile towards the open sea from a heavy oak sash window. "The window opens, sir, but be careful, as the frame can sometimes stick when damp. I see you have a case with you, so I'll leave you to unpack." Whistling quietly to herself, she returned downstairs. Harry spent the remainder of the day in his room relaxing after a long bus and train journey to get there from his home in Essex, where he left early that day for the long haul to the village. Harry was attracted by the history of the area, particularly a now long-lost abbey of St. Antoine, which once stood on the marshes. The abbey, a once grand structure of Gothic architecture, was a now-forgotten beacon of faith and learning in the region. After the dissolution of the Catholic Church by Henry VIII, the once thriving abbey was dismantled for its materials and used for building work. Some of the finer country houses in the district were built from its stone, leaving no legacy of its history, other than a few stumpy foundation stones that remained. He hoped to explore this area as part of a thesis he planned to write. Despite the prudent warnings of the landlady, he intended to explore there the following day and enjoy the serenity that once attracted the founding Cistercian monks to settle. It would be a day of walking, relaxation and historical research around this now forgotten landmark. That evening he enjoyed a meal in the lounge and decided to sit in the snug bar afterwards with a glass of beer, where a small party of locals had gathered to quaff a few frothy pints. As he walked in, they briefly stopped chatting at the presence of this interloper, and one of them, a rugged man with a weather-beaten face that resembled old leather, smiled at him and said, "Where ye from, young un?" Harry smiled in return, and the man, who introduced himself as Henry Beardsell, beckoned to sit beside him on a bench seat. "My name is Harry Holden, sir. I am here for a few days, enjoying a walking holiday and exploring the ruins of the old abbey." Henry, a partly retired fisherman, a grey-bearded old gentleman in his 70s, wearing a heavy dark-coloured cotton drill jacket and trousers, replied with a warning. "Those marshes ain't safe, Harry, as your tide can sometimes quicken when it comes in, and you can soon find yourself in trouble. I know the marshes like the back of my hand, and can guide you through the safe areas if you like." He smiled, having taken a shine to the young man, and jokingly said, "But it'll cost ye beers in the evening." Having agreed to help the following day at low tide, they chatted a while longer before Harry retired for the evening. They had arranged to meet outside the pub at 11 a.m. the next day. Next day they met as agreed. Henry, wearing wader boots, brought an extra pair for Harry to wear as part of the safe path was through some muddy or water-filled terrain. Harry was wearing a knapsack containing a map, 2 bottles of porter, sandwiches, and some small handheld portable digging tools for reviewing any site material at the ruins. After half an hour of negotiating a weaving path through the marshland, they eventually reached solid ground, which once was the foundation land of the old abbey. The monks had reclaimed this from the marsh by using oak pilings, and even now, centuries later, the land was grassed and was now partly used for cattle grazing by a farmer who had access from a former causeway leading from a neighbouring village some miles distant and much further down the coast. Both men stopped briefly and sat on the rump of an abbey wall to rest a little before exploring further. Henry, catching his breath as the trek was arduous across sticky mud, said, "What's your interest here, young man? Because other than yourself, others rarely come out thus far." "Oh, I'm studying archaeology, Henry, and this place has always fascinated me, as I could never understand why monks laboured so hard to build here. But now that I am sat here in its ruins, I can appreciate the splendid isolation." Henry, packing a clay pipe with coarse tobacco and then lighting it, said, "This place has many legends. There are stories of your ghostly monks seen here sometimes during the year, and even pirates believed to have landed treasure that they never reclaimed. Numerous people tell of seeing these men in a ghostly ship's rowing boat gliding into the inner reaches at night when the tide is in." He puffed his pipe and added, "But this is all nonsense, I can tell ye." Harry explored the ruins for the next hour using the tools he had brought, digging in odd places before reviewing the material. Nothing of much interest was revealed except a few broken remnants of patterned encaustic tile and a piece of carved stone that appeared to have been the tail of some mythological beast from an archway adornment, but little else of any significance. Seeing his disappointment, Henry suggested he take a break before returning. The tide would soon turn, making the shortcut across the marsh dangerous. Its muddy gullies would quickly fill with water, and the alternative route across the causeway would add many hours of walking before returning to the village. So reluctantly they sat down, drinking a cooling bottle of porter beer before trudging back to the village. On the way back, Henry, who had collected long twigs and small branches from a dead alder tree near the abbey, used them to mark out a safe path by pushing them upright into the soft mud, adding, "If you need to come back, look out for these and you'll be safe." As Henry was busy the next day, Harry decided to venture alone, using Henry's safe passage back to the ruins on the marshes. It was a bright, sunny day, with a gentle breeze common to these parts. Having the loan of Henry's wading boots certainly helped negotiate the obstacles, and very soon he was back to where they were the day before. This time, however, he decided to explore the remains of a stone-pillared wharf further out from the abbey and edging on the sea. Here, marshy gullies and samphire plants fringing them in tufts of dull greenness gave way to a flat morass of grey oozing mud. The sea by now was at its lowest ebb, and wading birds were picking out from the mud morsels of food and grubs, while others arrived and departed in search of fresh fare from other parts of the reaches. It was a pleasant enough scene. In the far distance, Harry could see skiffs sailing by into the breezy wind, which was much more potent and less protected by the shore. While probing around in the shoreline mud, Harry hit a solid object with his folding spade. He carefully removed mud from the surface, which was soon replaced by water, and then plunged his hand into it, pulling out from it the rusted remains of what appeared to be an old flintlock pistol, which was rusted and without a wooden butt handle, which would have rotted away many, many years ago. How unusual to find an ancient weapon that post-dated the abbey and surmised the boat or person must have come to grief by the old wharf, as such weapons were invaluable during periods of instability, and whilst no expert on firearms, he reasoned it must have dated to the 17th century and have been dropped by somebody coming into the marsh. He recalled the story Henry shared about the pirates and learned from history lessons at school about a famous battle between a pirate ship and the Royal Navy. Perhaps it was from one of the men who survived and came ashore. Perplexed as he could deduce no conclusive answer to its origins, he put the flintlock washed clean of mud into his knapsack and returned safely to the shore after finding nothing else of interest. Back in his room, he unpacked his knapsack and dried out the flintlock in the late afternoon sun beaming through the bedroom window. Later in the evening, after his meal in the lounge bar, he retired to his room. Placing the now dried-out rust-encrusted flintlock, he spent the next few hours cleaning and scraping it back to the bare metal. He saw that the weapon was richly engraved with scrolling designs and had the name Captain William Deane cut into the metal. Not knowing who this man was, he spoke to Mrs. German and her husband the next day, who were busy moving kegs of beer from a recent delivery into the cellar. They advised him to talk to the local vicar, the Reverend Smith, at the parish house next to St. Mary Church, a fine old 12th century building with a tall bell tower, used apparently as a landmark for mariners coming into the village from the sea. The vicar was a local historian with many years of research in the area and may be able to identify this name for him. When he arrived, he found the vicar weeding and hoeing in the garden. Looking at Harry, he stopped, placed down the hoe, and after wiping sweat from his hands on an apron, he smiled and shook his hand after formally greeting each other. The vicar, an educated man in his 60s, wore a clerical shirt and collar of the Anglican faith beneath the apron and looked very red in the face through his labouring in the sun. He wore a straw boater hat over a thin thatch of hair and a round-lensed pair of glasses, with a neatly trimmed moustache beneath his bulbous nose. He took him into the much cooler drawing room of the house, and after he sat down on a couch at his invitation, he handed him the pistol from the knapsack. He looked at it keenly, constantly turning it over in his hands and looking closely at the detailing and name. He mumbled quietly. I think you have something exciting. Yes, very interesting indeed. He excitedly and agitatedly continued. This weapon was the personal flintlock of William Deane, the pirate captain of the Terror, which sank after a sea battle with the Royal Navy in 1690. Most of the crew were killed or taken prisoner, but Deane and a few men were able to escape as it was dark by the time the Terror sank on fire off the coast of this village. Deane and these men were believed to have made it to shore, but until now nobody could confirm that. And here is his flintlock, which would have been one of a pair. At this moment his housekeeper came into the room and served them both a glass of homemade lemonade with ice, which Harry sipped while listening to the vicar, who himself gulped a mouthful and thanked his housekeeper. The lady, Mrs. Fitzsimmons, left them in the room, and he continued. Where was I? Oh yes, Captain Deane. Well, Deane was a native of this village and was returning to replenish supplies before the Navy engaged them. The village relied on Deane's patronage and kept quiet about these visits, but one local turned against him and told the customs men, and they arranged a trap set by the Navy. The ship is claimed to have had a chest of gold and silver that Deane took to the shore, but that is a rumour, and 20 years ago a man in a heavy diving suit explored what is left of the ship's remains, and nothing was found. It may well be that the treasure was taken to shore, and this flintlock circumstantially suggests that this is true. He paused. But if so, what happened to it? And there the question hung. Deane was a sufficiently well-known villain in these parts, and outside of the village he would not have had many friends, especially as the vicar told me that the Admiralty offered a substantial reward that existed for many years after his disappearance, and yet nobody tried to claim it. Harry then touched on the marshes being haunted by the legend of Deane and his men, and he informed him that locals often repeat the story of his boat entering the marsh at night. But he has not met anyone who has seen this phenomenon. In any case, these are just stories, and as a man of God he finds the story to be nonsense, as there is only one ghost, the Holy Ghost. All others are demons. On that note, Harry left the vicar after donating the flintlock to his small collection of locally collected artifacts and returned to the pub. Harry decided that the next night he would wait by the ruined wharf to see whether there was any truth to the haunting, as he, having seen a ghost in his home many years before, believed in them, and perhaps these ghostly shades may lead him to where they might have hidden the treasure. This was becoming quite an exciting adventure, although the thought of encountering spiritual presences on the marshes late at night filled him with some trepidation and fear. But now he wanted to see where it would lead. Having again spoken with his friend Henry, he loaned him the use of a reflector-type battery lantern which he borrowed from his fishing smack, the Renown, on the pretext of wandering safely around the village at night. Harry was able to buy spare batteries at the grocer's shop. After checking the tide table, Harry set off at low tide at 8 p.m, while it was still light, to get to the Abbey Wharf before 9 p.m. when it turned to dusk. He found the convenience of a low stone wall a few yards from the wharf, which sheltered him from a gathering breeze. It was a warm evening, but he wrapped up as well as he could in case the weather changed. For 3 hours or so, save for the sound of the occasional bird, it was very quiet and, frankly, for him, very dull. His eyes adjusted well to the night as it was a full moon, and he had a reasonable view of the wharf. At 12:30 a.m. he heard what sounded like the voices of men out to sea and in the far distance. The voices gradually grew louder as a long clinker-built rowing boat appeared into his view. As the boat drew into the shore, one of the men jumped out at the front and pulled a rope to one of the stone wharf pillars, where he tied it before whistling to the others, who all jumped out into the shallow water. yet their thigh boots made no sound. He could also see they wore dark tricorn hats, with one wearing a cape over his shoulders. Two of the men, with assistance from the others, carried a heavy wooden chest bound with metal straps from within the boat, which looked like an early safe with large metal studs. Harry could see a primitive-looking hand-forged padlock protecting a longer metal hasp that extended over and down its front. His heart pulsed wildly, and he thought that these quite fleshy-looking men could be the ghostly survivors of the Terror. Their clothing, of course, confirmed this. The figure in the cape pointed towards the abbey ruins, and the remaining crew members carried pickaxes in front of the heavy chest as they struggled to where the cape figure directed them. Yet there was still no sound as they passed him to a spot 40 feet away, where they stopped and started hacking silently into the rubble-filled earth. Harry crept closer, still hidden from view, and saw that they had dug a large hole big enough to conceal the chest, leaving at least 2 feet of soil to cover it completely, which was finished in minutes. They then tampered down the mound on top with their feet and spread the excess out evenly across the ground. Once completed, they disguised the dig area with a mound of rubble and then walked further inland where their bodies faded into the ether. And that was that. Harry then turned on his torch and walked over to the dig area, now with modern-day flattened rubble coated with weeds and grass. Using a stick he found, he forced it into the ground and left, trembling with every step for fear that an invisible presence would attack and silence him. But nothing happened, and so he returned to the pub and quietly let himself into the building and back to his room, where he fell asleep exhausted. The very next morning, Harry saw Henry sitting by the quay, chatting with another fisherman. Feeling quite elated, Harry greeted Henry with a warm good morning and asked if they could speak privately. Turning to his colleague, an old salt, Henry introduced him, saying, "This is my young friend Harry. He is here on holiday from university. I'll be back in a moment." The other man smiled, and Harry led Henry away, saying, "I think I have found the treasure." Henry laughed and replied, "Are ye joking with me, young man?" Looking solemn, Harry said emphatically, "I saw the boatmen, pirates, and followed them to where the treasure must be buried." Henry, appearing sceptical, responded, "It's too early for you to be drinking, so I guess you might be telling the truth." Harry recounted the details of the previous night's events while Henry listened attentively. Once Harry finished, Henry suggested that they must go there and dig to find out. However, digging during the day might attract unwanted attention, so his plan was they should go under the cover of darkness, as it would be 2 feet deep before they hit the lid of the chest, and since the ground is rocky, they will likely need a pickaxe and a shovel to move the dirt. Both then agreed to leave at 1 a.m, as the tide will be at its lowest, and hopefully they might strike pirate gold if it's still there. He shook Harry's hand and told him to wait for him at the quay at the agreed time. He also cautioned Harry not to tell anyone, as it was essential to keep their plan secret. Otherwise, others might reach the treasure before them. As he walked away, Henry stopped, turned to look at Harry, raised a finger to his lips to reinforce his silence, and continued walking. Harry returned to his room, trying to process everything he had seen, felt, and experienced. He savoured the possibility of recovering a stolen treasure hoard, not just for its monetary value, but also for the historical significance these items might hold for historians. More importantly, the influx of tourism such a discovery could bring to the village. As a budding archaeologist, this opportunity may aid his intended future in archaeology. In his youthful naivety, he could only envision the positive outcomes, not the greed or duplicity that often accompanies human nature. He felt comfortable with old Henry, a decent and reliable man nearing his life's end. Henry would undoubtedly want to leave this discovery as his legacy for future generations. Let's be honest, he reasoned, how many pirate treasure troves have ever been recovered? These were sobering thoughts, but for now they were best left aside until after they had discreetly investigated the site. He later bought 2 bottles of porter for the hard work ahead and made arrangements with the pub for sandwiches instead of a full evening meal, bringing them back to his room to be packed. He didn't want anyone to know that his snacks and beer were intended for the early hours, and after he had finished exhaustively digging at the site. Finally the hour came and Harry and Henry met at the quay. Having adjusted their eyes to the waning moon, they made their way across the marsh. This time they could see a mist rolling in from the sea, and by the time they arrived the site was covered in thick pea-soup fog. Luckily for Harry, Henry knew the area so intimately that he would indeed be lost and disorientated without his guidance. Having arrived at the spot, the younger Harry started digging into the stony ground with the pick, and before long he had cleared at least a depth of 2 feet, while Henry shovelled the dirt and debris to one side. Suddenly the pick struck something metallic within the hole, and both men smiled excitedly under the light from Henry's Tilly lamp. "This is it!" exclaimed Harry, and Henry, now excited, said, "Carry on, lad, I think we have found our reward." Presently the pick hauled up the remains of some metal strapwork, and both men on their hands and knees scooped out dirt covering an appearing void. Once the hole was sufficiently cleared, Harry plunged his hand inside and pulled out a crude golden ingot. Holding it up to the light, he exclaimed, "Henry, look, this is it. We have finally found it. The lost treasure is here." Both men's faces beamed delight at the find, and out of the void came more ingots, cut-up gold and silver jewellery, and many Spanish gold doubloons. Before long they had removed all the pieces of gold and silver, which formed a vast bounty of glittering wealth piled up beside them. In their excitement, both men did not notice the appearance of 6 ragged men standing beside them. Their faces, half rotted in appearance, scowled down in contempt at the 2 diggers, and a foul smell of rotting flesh caused them to look up. The horror of what they saw made them recoil and scream at this manifestation of evil, which stared intensely with glowing red eyes that were devoid of eyelids but full of seething hate. Their lamps suddenly dimmed into darkness, and their piercing screams at this revulsion echoed across the marshes as the men finally withdrew their swords from the scabbards to deal with them. The next day, a farmer driving his cattle onto the abbey grounds saw the horrific sight of 2 men lying dead and contorted on their backs with a striking look of terror in their eyes. Both had multiple stab wounds, which the coroner later declared to be the work of a sabre and sword. And stranger still, each man had a golden old Spanish doubloon in their mouth. Yet despite the presence of a pick and spade, the ground was undisturbed, and the lamp was empty of fuel. Their belongings, too, were untouched, and their deaths baffled police for years to come, with no evidence found to identify their killers. The crime, however, ultimately had a positive outcome. Tourism flourished, leading to the construction of many new villas, which attracted newcomers drawn by the area's rich history, natural beauty, and the weirdest murders of the decade. The wharf is now a bustling port with weekend sailors and boat owners, and in a sense the village did discover its treasure thanks to the legend of Captain William Deane and his men from the Terror. It is said that the marshes are haunted by ethereal screams of terror, with wildfowlers and fishermen terrified by the luminosity of a light guiding 2 ghostly shades across the marsh. Despite many risking their lives and sanity searching frantically for lost treasure, nobody as yet has been able to find it. The End. The Folly, written and read by Christopher Halton. Although imparted to me by letter, this account was shared by a reputable source with impeccable references, the late Reverend Dr. L.G. Swinton. Lionel Swinton, who held a doctorate in theology at Cambridge University, was my mentor and friend when I studied there. As such, we kept in reasonably regular contact over the years, and the details I am to share are based on a written account sent to me just a few months before he passed away in 1889. Despite being the youngest son of Basil Swinton, Lord Rothmere, a wealthy hereditary peer who held a large country estate of 1,000 acres at Rothmere Hall in the county of Lancashire, Lionel was as far removed from this life as anyone could imagine. He was in fact a quiet, gentle, down-to-earth man of a kindly disposition, with little love for wealth or status. Lionel, second in line to the family estate, had entered the church, while Algernon, his older brother, opted for a commission in the army and later served in both India and South Africa before succeeding to the estate and hereditary title following his father's death some 25-odd years ago. Both brothers could not be more opposite in personality. Algernon was vain and lacked empathy for anyone outside his social class, while Lionel was a warm and gregarious man who regarded all as equal under God and had even set up a charity to assist the poor while working as a priest in India. In 1885, Lionel returned to England, having been worn down by illness, age and fatigue, and was in need of somewhere to recuperate and settle into his planned early retirement. However, the adjustment was difficult, as Lionel was very much a gypsy at heart, and the thought of merely retiring to somewhere tedious and sedentary was a daunting prospect that he found difficult to embrace. In his heart he still wanted to serve God, and it was by some good fortune that an opening for a country priest was made available to him following the death of the incumbent vicar at Rothmere village, a parish adjunct to Rothmere Hall, where his reclusive and older brother Algernon still resided. Neither brother had spoken to each other in several years, and upon hearing news of his brother's impending return, Algernon invited him to visit and stay for a few days before moving on and taking up his new post at Rothmere Vicarage. The journey from London was slow and uneventful by train, and by prior arrangement, on a late and very wet June afternoon, he was met at the station by a dog cart from Rothmere Hall. This cart took him and several pieces of luggage to the front steps of the family seat, while servant staff from the vicarage took on the remainder to his new home. Rothmere Hall was a grand Palladian-style country house built of mellow sandstone, with a large colonnaded and pedimented entrance adorned with Roman and Greek deities. The approach to the hall was by a road lined with lime trees that spanned acres of green parkland filled with cattle and sheep, which passed over a stone bridge that spanned an elongated lake, with the rest of the estate taken up by forestry and acres of arable farmland and pasture. As he viewed it from passing over the apex of the bridge, the house seemed grander than he last remembered it. Still, with its 21 bedrooms and many en-suites, it looked more reminiscent of a palace than a country seat occupied by one man and 20 servants, for Algernon had never married and became a lifelong misogynist following the alleged rejection of the one woman in his life who refused his proposal of marriage. Looking very much a dashing squire, the tall, slim 60-year-old Lord Rothmere greeted his brother with an outstretched hand from the entrance. He was wearing a hacking jacket, shirt, cravat, jodhpurs, and mud-splattered riding boots, apparently having just returned from a hunt on the estate. "By Jove," he said upon greeting Lionel, "we haven't seen you here for many of a year, dear brother. How the devil are you?" Despite years since they had last seen each other, he had lost nothing of that cold arrogance that even a forced smile had failed to conceal. As a child, he was always a bully and the centre of attention, and being the eldest, he was groomed to be the Lord of Rothmere, while his erstwhile brother neither had the looks or the passage of right to be anything other than a second fiddle, and was treated as such. But his enduring quality was his heart, as he was known to be a kindly and generous child, the opposite of Algernon in every possible way. While servants carried his luggage up to his beautifully spacious front-facing bedroom, Lionel enjoyed having a high balcony which offered panoramic views across the lake and parkland. He later dressed for dinner and left his room to walk down the sweeping marble and gilt gold staircase, which took him from the hallway into a portrait-lined dining room. Algernon was sat at the head of the table as befitted the squire of Rothmere Hall, and a table waiter withdrew a mahogany Sheraton dining chair, upon which Lionel sat down next to his brother, who immediately engaged him in small talk, which lasted for the duration of dinner together. It was clear from his attitude and mannerisms that something was troubling him. Despite gentle probes by Lionel, he was not prepared to talk about matters other than past acquaintances and life serving the Queen and country in the military. Algernon preferred his old life, but now living this life was not to his liking. As heir to their father's wealth and estate, he seemed at least resigned to his fate, living in what Lionel thought was more of a gilded cage with benefits. Lionel inquired with Algernon about taking a pony and trap the following day, to ride around the estate to familiarise himself again with the memories he had held since he left Rothmere so many years ago. Algernon was agreeable to that proposition and the opportunity to ride to his new parish to meet the staff and his soon-to-be parishioners, who were only a few miles away. Having withdrawn later to the drawing-room for more glasses of port with his brother, he retired to bed and peacefully slept once more in his family home before setting off early the following day on his rounds. The morning was warm and sunny, with a vaporizing mist clinging to the lake's surface. Having been assisted into the trap by a footman, he set off towards the lake, crafted earlier in the previous century by the most revered of all landscape architects, Lancelot Capability Brown. This vista of contrived beauty was fringed by steep embankments and fitted snugly among a forest of ash, oak and elm. As he crossed the stone bridge over the lake, he stopped briefly to admire the beautiful landscape stretched out on both sides for a few miles in either direction and set perfectly by weeping willows fringing the water's edge. He remembered that to the east of this was a stone folly in the form of a Grecian temple that his grandfather had commissioned so many years before and used as a family summer house, which still stood in elegant prominence overlooking the far bank, about a quarter of a mile distant from where he briefly stopped before continuing to arrive at the Folly a short while later. As he approached the building, which stood some 20 feet in diameter, he was surprised to observe a rather handsome-looking lady walking gracefully from the lakeside towards the Folly. She was young, slim and elegant, with long blonde tresses that bobbed gently on her shoulders and back. She was a sight to behold, as indeed she was a beautiful woman in many ways to the eyes of the admiring priest. Quite unaware of her identity, he stopped his trap and walked over to speak with her. Seemingly aware of his presence, she stopped briefly, turned around, smiled, and walked on before entering the building. Following behind, barely a few seconds away, he was shocked to discover that the entrance door she had just passed was locked or jammed tightly shut in the doorframe. Worse, the structure appeared neglected and unkempt, a far cry from his childhood memory. He then peered through the dusty and cobwebbed glass-panelled door, but despite rubbing the dirty glass, he could not see anyone within other than the fact that it had peeling paint and traces of dampness in the ceiling, which was still beautifully adorned with a fresco painted by the noted Italian artist Agostino Brunias in 1760, who was a friend of the architect Robert Adam, who coincidentally had also been engaged at the time with the rebuilding of Rothmere Hall, from a brick and stone 14th century fortified manor house to the magnificent and much larger palatial home of today. History put aside, this disappearing woman was a fascinating mystery to him, and he decided later to ask his brother who this visitor might be. But first he had other matters to attend to, including meeting the staff at his new parish house and visiting the 11th century church to view the graves of his forebears. When he arrived at the vicarage at 2 p.m. that day, he was greeted by his cook, a redoubtable middle-aged lady named Mrs. Bright. Mrs. Bright also acted as housekeeper and supervised the staff, including a maid and a footman. She was a tall, large lady in her mid-50s who capably took up the post at the vicarage following her husband's untimely death 5 years earlier, and lived alone in staff lodgings within the 6-bedroom clergy house. Being a childless widow, life at the vicarage suited her. The meeting was, to say the least, rather than he had expected. She was aware of his relationship and connection to Rothmere Hall and its owner, Lord Rothmere, who appeared none too popular with her, and 2 parishioners who were present when he arrived. Knowing his brother's character and temperament, it was understandable, and Lionel went to great lengths to assuage any fears that he was of the same ilk. Having broken the ice, as it were, Mrs. Bright seemed much more relaxed and welcoming as she introduced the staff and the locals who were still present. Having been shown around his new home, a timber-framed and wainscoted 16th century house, and briefly visiting the church, he left for Rothmere after leaving Mrs. Bright with instructions and a promise to return within a few days. Lionel was back in time for evening dinner and engaged his brother with the events of that day, obviously leaving out Mrs. Bright's initial doubts about Algernon. As was customary, he joined his brother later in the drawing room, where both settled down with another good bottle of port from the cellar. Here Lionel inquired about the identity of the lady he had seen by the lake and how she seemingly vanished after entering the Folly. Algernon's reaction was positively sour. Staring intently at his brother as he leaned forward, he said rather curtly, "You are mistaken, dear boy. The Folly hasn't been used in years and is always locked. How on earth could anyone enter under such conditions? You must have been confused by the light. It's pretty strong at that time of the day. However, I will ask my staff if they have any idea and to be on the lookout if she returns." From then on, the subjects discussed were estate management related and whether Lionel would like to accompany the gamekeeper the following day, as the estate had a fine stock of red deer, game birds and rabbits. Lionel was superficially interested because he had no intention of hunting due to his views on such matters and the infirmity of his health. Having finished off the port, both men retired to bed, and on the following morning he joined the gamekeeper, Mr. Tomkinson, who drove a 2-horse open carriage, which afforded plenty of space to relax on the ride around the estate. During the journey, Tomkinson commented on how the game is managed and also that the lake contained some fine trout, for which he was forever having problems with people fishing there illegally. He added that despite Lord Rothmere being a local magistrate who swiftly dispensed fines or imprisonment on offenders, even that failed as a deterrent. While discussing trespassers, Lionel asked him about the mysterious lady by the lake. Tomkinson strangely became subdued and tried to change the subject, but Lionel had none of that and pressed him further. Shortly they stopped at the Temple Folly, and having disembarked from the carriage, he ushered Lionel over to the entrance. Looking somewhat nervous, he stared Lionel directly in the face and said, "Reverend, you asked about the lady. Yes, I have seen her once, as you described. I don't believe in ghosts. She looked pretty real when I first saw her. But when asking around, people say that she drowned here in mysterious circumstances, and some years ago after his lordship took over the estate. I was shocked, I can tell you. I do not know who she was, as it was before my time, but she might have been a member of the landed gentry. I heard she slipped and fell into the lake after spending the day here at the summer house and drowned. But for my life, I don't even know what happened afterwards. Your brother, Lord Rothmere, apparently took charge of this and refused to discuss the matter further. He then paused and implored Lionel, "I beg of you not to mention this to his lordship, as he has a pretty nasty temper, and I fear losing my home here, which is a tied estate cottage. I hope you understand, Vicar." Lionel sympathetically touched his shoulder and assuringly replied, "As a man of God and the cloth, you have my word." A now more relaxed Tomkinson had a key to the entrance door, which opened fully after a good push. Once inside, it was apparent that nobody had set foot inside for many a year, and everything was coated with a fine layer of dust. Despite its neglected state, it still looked beautiful. The frescoes were still in good condition, as with the rest of the building, which had a domed leaded roof supported on 4 sandstone columns and was filled with glass window frames. The woodwork was complete and undamaged, but the paintwork was starting to blister with age, exposing the bare oak framework beneath. Although sadly dilapidated, it returned pleasant memories for Lionel. But unusually, he found some graffiti carved inside a heart on a Grecian-style wooden bench with the initials AS and GD 1865. He immediately recognized the carving style as his brother and believed his initials confirmed this, but he pondered who GD was. He returned with the gamekeeper to the house, and with the aid of numerous Burke's Peerage editions found in the library, he looked for any information that might shed light on the identity of GD. After some hours of diligence, he discovered the announcement of the birth of a daughter, Geraldine Dampier, to Viscount and Lady Dampier on the 26th of April, 1844. The Dampiers, now extinct, formerly resided at Melrose House, a country estate some 5 miles distant from Rothmere, which was destroyed by fire in 1866 with the loss of the parents, but no mention of their only daughter, who would have been 22 years old at the time. It was feasible that Geraldine Dampier may have left the family home to marry, but nothing could be confirmed. However, after reading several editions, Lionel found that this GD was the only one with a suitable social standing in the district who could have visited Rothmere Hall. Realizing that Geraldine might be Algernon's lost love interest, he casually remarked on the discovery of the graffiti with him during dinner. Upon hearing of this, Algernon casually claimed it was news to him, and that perhaps the graffiti was caused by trespassers, as the summer house used to be left unlocked. But when Lionel asked about the Dampier family, he became quite indignant and slammed his knife and fork on the table, momentarily causing a wine bottle to rattle. With a raised voice, he stood up and said, "I don't want to talk about the Dampier family. They were nothing but problems for me." Although somewhat taken aback, Lionel responded that he had heard of the fire and wondered what happened to their daughter Geraldine. He returned to his seat and said, somewhat calmer, "I am sorry for this outburst, but I have my reasons and do not wish to discuss these matters further." For the next few minutes, Algernon sat in silence and barely touched his meal before he left on the pretext of answering urgent correspondence. He said he would not be joining Lionel in the drawing room later. Lionel retired to his room for an early night, but the events surrounding Geraldine and her parents kept him awake for hours as he tried desperately to sleep. Eventually, in the small hours, he succumbed, but because of the lateness of the hour, he almost missed breakfast in the morning. Algernon, however, was nowhere to be seen, having left earlier to ride into town on business, according to the dining room maid. Using the opportunity in his brother's absence to leave unannounced, he took a pony and trap into his parish, hoping to find more information on the fire's circumstances and Geraldine's whereabouts. He felt confident that as a priest, someone somewhere would be able to fill in any missing details. His first call was with Mrs. Bright again at the vicarage. If anyone knew, he felt it would be her. When he arrived, she was busy cleaning the kitchen and seemed in no mood for chit-chat. Of course, realizing that Lionel was her employer, she stopped, quickly wiped her hands on her apron, smiled, and asked him politely if he needed anything. Lionel inquired about the fire at Melrose House and their daughter's fate. Before answering, she paused momentarily and took her eyes away from Lionel, apparently in a thoughtful mode, before taking a deep breath and replying rather solemnly, "Yes, I recall the fire. Terrible it was. It was believed an oil lamp tipped over in their bedroom as they lay asleep, and before help could get to them, they died. I'm not sure about the daughter, Lady Geraldine. I think she moved away sometime before the fire, but I can't be exact." She paused briefly. "And if I remember correctly, his lordship, your brother, was a frequent visitor there back in the day. He wasn't seen for weeks after that fire. I guess he was overcome with grief, as I thought he and the Dampiers were close friends. Yes, that's all I remember, Vicar." Her comments quietly shocked Lionel, for he recalled his brother's hostility, but he kept that to himself and went to the church records of births, marriages and deaths held in the vicarage's small library. Although he found the recorded birth of Geraldine and the death of her parents, nothing whatsoever was indicated of Geraldine's fate. He was sure his brother knew far more than he was prepared to say, so he focused more intently on the summer-house Folly and his irascible brother. Somewhere between the two, he mused, has to be the truth. Before returning to Rothmere Hall, he sorted through some personal effects in preparation for his incumbency at the church. He arranged for the footman to repair his pony and trap, and unexpectedly, upon leaving, he saw Mrs. Bright standing in the hallway and holding what appeared to be a framed photograph in her hands. She rushed to Lionel and said, "I just remembered this, Vicar. It is a photograph of Lady Geraldine handing out an award to the village cricket team. It is undated, but it shows who she is, in case you meet her." He studied the image, and a sudden chill down his spine recognised that Lady Geraldine and the lady at the Folly were, in fact, the same person. More interesting to note was that she was depicted handing a trophy to the village cricket team's captain, with his brother caught standing behind them in clear view. And Algernon, he thought, looked quite unhappy as he stared somewhat sharply towards Geraldine. "Thank you, Mrs. Bright. This is indeed very interesting. May I borrow it to share with my brother, Lord Rothmere? I am sure he'll be as interested as I am." With a smile, he left with the photograph to return one final time to Rothmere Hall. He was expected to start his new post at the vicarage in 2 days, and some preparation was needed. On the journey back, he reflected again on all the information he had concerning his brother and the mysterious Lady Geraldine, and he thought it not unreasonable to suggest that Geraldine may be his unrequited love and his former objet de passion. But if the photo and the woman at the lake are the same, it is pretty apparent she is dead. But the mystery revolving around her passing remained unresolved. Lionel now felt sure that his brother may have murdered her or was involved in her death, and that perhaps in the lake or the grounds of Rothmere her remains were hidden. Unfortunately, proving this to any authority would be impossible without hard evidence to back it up, other than a photograph and a ghost story. He sat for dinner that evening again with his brother, but never mentioned his suspicions, research, or the photograph. He knew that regardless, Algernon would deny any involvement and may, when confronted again, ask him to leave and ban him from returning. That evening, on the pretext of having to prepare his move to the vicarage, he returned to his room. As it was a fine warm evening, he sat on the balcony to relax for a few hours, reading a book before bed. From this viewpoint on the 3rd floor, he enjoyed the panoramic view, which barely included the Folly, which was some distance away. As darkness drew in, he felt certain that a light could be faintly observed in that building. As it was twilight, he assumed his eyes were playing up and at first ignored it, but as it turned to darkness, the light seemed brighter and twinkled like someone was inside. Putting on suitable clothing and carrying a lamp, he felt emboldened to see who or what was inside at this unearthly hour. Before leaving, he crept into the library, where keys to estate properties were kept on a hook in a bookcase. Having liberated the key to the Folly, he proceeded on foot towards this building, which was some 15 minutes or so away from the house. Under normal circumstances, he would be wary of making such a journey, but he prayed for divine protection and set off alone. As he got closer, the Folly was indeed illuminated, and from 50 yards distant, he saw a figure of someone inside moving around. Of course, the dirty cobweb windows obscured clarity, and it was only when he reached the locked entrance door that he saw inside the form of a woman who looked perfectly solid and real. He could now see with certainty that it was Geraldine, and he could also observe that she was staring at him and pointing at the floor quite sternly. As he opened the door, it suddenly went dark inside, and Absolutely nothing. He walked around the interior, holding his lamp high, but it was empty. He then realized Geraldine may have actually provided him with proof of where she was interred. Although this manifestation's appearance was naturally disconcerting, his curiosity about resolving it overtook any fears or apprehensions he most certainly harboured. He saw that the floor was laid with thick oak planks, and resting on his knees, he realized that the middle section appeared quite loose when a pocket knife blade was introduced between each plank. His suspicions now appeared confirmed as to where she was buried, but being a prominent local figure, he knew he would have to officially report this to the police to get them to organise a warrant to enter the property to carry out an excavation. He also knew this would prove impossible, as his brother was the local squire and magistrate, and his evidence of this crime would prove incredulous beyond rational belief. Instead, he decided to hatch a plan to catch his brother in flagrante delicto. During breakfast, he met Algernon in the dining room and told him everything that had happened the night before, substituting Geraldine's ghost with a real man. He suggested that he appeared to be showing an unusual interest in the floor and was trying to prise the boards up. He thought he was probably a local man trying to steal the wood because they were quality oak and had value. He added that when he challenged the man who, realizing that Lionel was a man of the cloth, pushed him to the ground and fled. Lionel added that the door was undamaged and unlocked, but after the man disappeared into the night, he locked it himself as he had the key from the library. He knew that getting the police there promptly was pointless at this late hour, as the man had since long gone, and for the same reason, he didn't report it that night to his brother, as nothing had been stolen or damaged. Algernon looked quite sweaty as he listened to Lionel's detailed account. Instead of going into one of his characteristic rages, he said he would make inquiries and deal with this problem personally. He thanked his brother, and as Lionel was leaving that morning for the vicarage, he said he would visit him soon at his new post. Lionel was sure that Algernon would now probably visit the Folly that evening to remove any remains of Geraldine under the cloak of darkness, as to do so during the day might alert any number of his employees. After breakfast, Algernon's servants loaded Lionel's luggage onto a horse and cart and took him and his belongings onto the vicarage. After arriving at his new home, he instructed his staff to remove the luggage from the cart and unpack it while he went for a walk around the village. In truth, he went out to seek the village policeman, P.C. Reginald Oliver, a moustached ex-military man in his late 40s who lived in the station house with his wife and children. As he discovered, Oliver had served in India before joining the police. Both men spent an enjoyable hour together exchanging anecdotes over a mug of tea served by his wife, Grace. It was clear that P.C. Oliver enjoyed Lionel's company, and now he intended to enlist the officer as an innocent confederate in the second part of his scheme. He told P.C. Oliver the same story he had shared with Algernon. He suggested that as his brother may be away, he would be prepared to accompany the officer if free to the Folly, hoping to catch the would-be thief returning during the darkness. P.C. Oliver readily agreed and arranged to meet by the estate's main entrance gate at 10 p.m. that night. The walk to the Folly from here with a shortcut through woodland would take minutes. Having now all the arrangements in place, he later met P.C. Oliver as agreed, who arrived on his police cycle, which he had left hidden just inside the trees, as he accompanied Lionel on foot. Sure enough, on their approach, they could see the Folly was illuminated by what appeared to be a hurricane lamp, and inside they saw a man digging feverishly into the floor, with the floorboards neatly stacked to one side. P.C. Oliver immediately stepped inside and was about to apprehend the man when he realized Algernon was digging. "Oh, I'm sorry, my lord," he said apologetically, "but I received a report from the Reverend here that someone may be planning to steal the oak floorboards." Red-faced, P.C. Oliver was about to make excuses to leave when he saw in the hole the barely unearthed rotted remains of a blonde woman wearing the tattered remnants of a dress. Shocked at such a horrific sight, P.C. Oliver exclaimed, "Hang on, sir, that's a body lying there. Could you care to explain this?" Algernon, still holding a spade, immediately reacted by attempting to swing it in a rage at the officer, who was quick to dart out of the way of a glancing blow before lunging himself at Algernon as he attempted to make good his escape. Once restrained, as Algernon was no match for the officer's size and strength, P.C. Oliver arrested him on suspicion of murder and the unlawful disposal of a dead body. Algernon, with eyes of fiery temper, screamed at his brother, "It was you that set this up, you blackguard, and now I am done for." Lionel felt no satisfaction in his brother's betrayal and looked down at his feet to avert Algernon's crazed gaze as P.C. Oliver took him, restrained and handcuffed, through the door. Still, morally, he knew he did the right thing, and now his brother would inevitably face justice for this terrible crime, and, hopefully, Lady Geraldine would finally be laid to rest. At no time did Lionel admit to his sighting of Lady Geraldine's ghost, realizing that the newspapers would have a field day with this national news story, which ran for weeks in the press, at home and abroad. Algernon later appeared at the Old Bailey, where he pled guilty to the charges of murdering Lady Geraldine by strangulation and also of murdering her parents by arson. They had suspected he killed their daughter and had threatened to expose Algernon to the authorities. Rather than risk a police inquiry, he decided it would be simpler to be rid of them by burning down their 14th century timber-framed home with a lit oil lamp thrown through a leaded window. Earlier during the trial, when asked by prosecution counsel why he killed Lady Geraldine, he simply said that Geraldine was his only true love, and having rejected him, he strangled her in a fit of rage in the summer house where he later buried her. He added that she tormented him for years from the grave every night in his sleep, but he now felt at rest with himself and could sleep peacefully again. Algernon, to his credit, fully admitted to these crimes as he wanted a clear conscience before facing his inevitable fate on the hangman's rope after having been sentenced before his peers for these abominable murders. The estate, title and wealth later passed into Lionel's guardianship. Still, with no heirs to pass the estate on to, he wanted none of the now tarnished family name and reputation, so he disposed of the estate property and assets. The proceeds were then distributed through a trust fund to support children's orphanages at home and abroad. As Lady Geraldine had no surviving family, Lionel agreed to officiate at her funeral, with Mrs. Bright and villagers present as mourners. While she was being laid to rest next to her parents in the family vault at Rothmere Church, someone reported that they briefly saw Lady Geraldine among the 20-odd mourners present, although, of course, none of this could be confirmed. But from this moment, Lady Geraldine's ghost was never seen again, and Lionel went to his grave a few years later, a quietly contented man. The end. Lady Fitzalen's Room, written and read by Christopher Halton. I penned this account some years past, following an unexpected turn of events during one of the most severe winter storms on record. The storm, a complete surprise to the coastal regions of Essex, marked one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. But that, as you will soon discover, was just the beginning of my account. In early February 1820, I travelled by mail coach from Colchester to the port of Harwich, where I planned to embark by packet boat on a business trip to the continent. The journey started fairly uneventfully when we set off from the George Hotel coaching inn early in the afternoon. The sky was clear and bright, although a frosty winter sun still glistened ice from the roofs of passing houses. The air was so bitter that even the nostrils of the mail coach's horses emitted a thick cloud of steamy air as they pressed hard along the icy-packed stone road, but at least the climate was still manageable. Our coach driver, a rather stocky and bullish fellow called Dodgson, and his guard were quite determined from the start of the journey that we would arrive on time, as competition was fierce on these coaching routes. The almost maniacal cracking of his whip on now sweaty horseflesh ensured the weather did not delay us despite the condition of the slippery road that frequently caused the coach to slide on its dangerous icy sheen. The fear was palpable on my face and the faces of two accompanying passengers, a middle-aged man and a woman. She had a certain air of good breeding, whilst her partner lacked the same bearing quality and seemed somewhat duplicitous, with two beady eyes and a round ruddy face in dire need of a good shave. As I observed, he struck me as no gentleman. Although he and the woman were well dressed, they both seemed incongruous as a couple. By way of polite introduction, they said they were the Reverend Anstruther and his wife Imelda, who were as hoping as I was to catch the 7 p.m. packet departing from Harwich to the Hook of Holland. Their keenness to leave that evening was indicative of other passengers at the George being unwilling to accompany us that day because of the frigid prevailing weather. For my own case, it was necessary, as I had a meeting with business contacts in Brussels, which could not be delayed. However, we were all well wrapped in blankets, which to a degree removed the acerbity of the cold. Our comfort, however, was secondary to the driver and guard, and despite protestations by banging our fists on the coach wall behind the driver to slow down, we were ignored entirely. And so, for the next hour, the sliding and bumpy coach continued on its route until the ice slowly thawed as a warmer yet ominous presence of dark clouds drew in across the sky. The journey should have taken around 4 hours in typical weather, but despite the coachman's best efforts, the prevailing conditions delayed the journey. The horses were struggling as it started to snow in flurries, which soon became heavier and blizzard-like as a strong wind blew in from the North Sea. The headwind turned the dull greyness of a winter landscape into whiteness as the snow settled and started to drift. The fear and anxiety were perceptible, and the Anstruthers became increasingly uneasy as the situation worsened. Reluctantly, Dodgson and the guard stopped the horses and jumped off from their open seats to speak to us. Dodgson, a bearded man in his late 30s, was undoubtedly tough. He was small in stature but physically well built, and had the bearing and demeanour of a former soldier. He was well padded against the cold in a 3/4 length frock coat, a top hat and thick leather gloves. The male guard, a much younger man in his 20s, was much taller and slimmer than Dodgson. He was dressed in a Royal Mail employee's uniform, a gold-braided scarlet frock coat with blue lapels and a black top hat with a gold band. He was clean-shaven and introduced himself as Richard Mortimer, speaking with a soft East Midlands accent. As we gathered around the two men, we shielded our faces with our arms from the biting ice. Such was the veracity of the weather. Dodgson's assertive voice informed us that it would be impossible to proceed further, but he knew of a nearby country house that may offer us shelter until the worsening weather blew over. None of us was pleased, as we would undoubtedly miss the packet. However, to proceed further would be suicide, as the landscape was slowly absorbed by a blanket of drifting snow, which provided even greater danger should we accidentally leave the road and enter a ditch. Frustratingly, we agreed to his proposal, and within 15 minutes of literally driving through a white wall of blown drifting snow, we arrived at the signposted Fitzalen House, a large, rambling, timber-framed Elizabethan-era manorial building situated well off the beaten track. By this time, the blizzard had eased as the wind dropped, but the snow was as relentless as ever. The house was imposing, constructed of a sturdy English oak frame and filled with herringbone brick. The 4 chimneys, made of the same material, were formed into twisted spirals, adding a touch of grandeur to the structure. The window frames were of mullioned oak and fitted with leaded glass, which were painted with armorial bearings depicting a variety of shields and heraldic emblems, adding to the place's mystery and intrigue. It was plainly once a house owned by a noble family, but who I was yet to discover. But first, something was odd and inescapable. There appeared to be no smoke from the chimneys nor any lights within. Dodgson wearily took the coach to the side of the building where a yard and stables came into view. Having halted and alighted from the coach, he instructed us to wait with the mail guard while he went to the house to speak with the owner. The guard then unhitched the 4 horses and took them to a large barn where they were tethered. After some minutes, Dodgson failed to return, and darkness was drawing in. Mortimer was very concerned, as indeed were we. He drew a loaded blunderbuss firearm from the coach and asked us to accompany him, as he intended to find out what the delay was. The Anstruvers feared what fate may have befallen the driver and decided to remain wrapped warmly in blankets inside the coach while we went to investigate. Mr. Anstruver had a loaded flintlock for protection and insisted they would be far better and safer to sit briefly until our return. We agreed and set off in the now 6-inch deep snow, which gathering apace had virtually covered Dodgson's tracks. The journey to the house was eerie, the only sound being the crunch of our boots in the snow. The darkness seemed to swallow us whole as we trudged through the snow, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. From the faint traces left in the snow, we were led to a rear door with ornate Elizabethan figures carved around the frame. The heavy door, by comparison, was plainly panelled with a wrought iron ring knocker, which I rapped once. It was swiftly answered by Dodgson, who was in the process of returning to the coach. "Ah," he smiled, "I have just spoken to the caretaker, Mr. Ambrose, as the owners are abroad, and he has agreed to allow us to stay due to the weather. He was in the house checking the property because of it." He then explained that the conditions for a living are Spartan, as the house has been empty since this past year, as the owner, Sir Lawrence Fitzalen, prefers living in his estate in Italy. He apparently inherited Fitzalen Hall from his late aunt, but has never actually set foot here. As such, Mr. Ambrose didn't think there would be an issue, but there are conditions, as he will explain shortly. He then escorted us from the rear kitchen into a lofty wainscoted hall of considerable size, which now had a lit log fire in the large brick fireplace. Dodgson and Mortimer left us briefly to remove our luggage and the mail for safeguarding during the night. This brief respite from all that was happening allowed me some minutes to admire the architecture. The hall was in fact of 14th century medieval design. It had a beamed ceiling that arched into the braced roof, and in the middle, facing from the rear of the building, a minstrel gallery overlooking the hall to its heavy flagstoned floor. It was a truly archaic design, wondrously adorned with shields bearing various coats of arms similar to those on the windows, with a suit of armour standing almost imperiously on guard by the main door holding a sword. In contrast, other weaponry such as pikes, axes and swords embellished the dark wooden panelling. Additionally, the walls had Elizabethan-era motifs and figures carved into the woodwork. The central piece was a truly ancient refectory table with long benches seating perhaps 20 people. It was a medieval masterpiece, although the others were less than impressed, especially with the now gathered Anstruvers complaining that it felt more like a mausoleum than a house. Still, even they had to agree the prospect of staying in this 5-bedroom property was better than freezing to death in a mail coach. After both men had completed the removals from the coach, they stood and warmed themselves in front of the fire. Mortimer then elected to remain in the hall with the mail and sleep on a rug near the fire, while everyone else waited for Mr. Ambrose to return and delegate rooms. Presently Mr. Ambrose joined us, wearing a fur hat and sheepskin coat. He was probably in his early 70s, and was quite sprite for his age. He was holding a lit candlestick, which lit brightly his ready-cheeked face with a kindly demeanour and warm, gentle eyes. Calling us all to the refectory table, he swept his hands to indicate that we sat down, whilst he stood at the head of the table, having placed the candle before him. Clearing his throat before the assembled guests, he said with an assuring voice, "I must admit I certainly wasn't expecting guests tonight, but outside, had I refused, you would surely have perished from the cold. and as a God-fearing man, I could not let that happen. He cleared his throat and continued. I have prepared 3 rooms for you and have found sufficient blankets to remain warm. I have also prepared a fire for you in each room, but there is little here that would afford greater comfort. Sadly, there is no food in the kitchen, but a pump there will supply clean drinkable water from a spring. Should you want to fortify yourself on this cold night, some bottles of brandy are in the cassone chest by the fireplace with glasses. He paused, then added, I will bring you some eggs and cooked pork in the morning. I have provided hay for your horses. They should be safe in the barn. My only fear is whether the weather will clear in time to allow you all to leave in the morning. Looking more serious, he stressed, You have the free rein of the house, but I would ask you not to enter the room that stands before you immediately at the top of the stairs and in front of the staircase. That was my late employer's room, Lady Fitzalen. There is nothing in there of interest, but I have left the door locked according to her wishes and out of respect. He then showed us to our respective rooms while we deposited our baggage. After that, he bade us good night and left to return to his home with a lantern and wearing snowshoes, as the soft ice was now at least a foot deep. It had stopped snowing, and the wind had finally cleared, leaving a full moon in the clear night sky. I finally breathed a sigh of relief, and after sharing a glass of brandy with the others, I retired to my room for a hopefully less eventful night's sleep, while remaining clothed to keep warm. A woman's scream awakened me from my slumber a few hours later. Confused by my sleepiness, I scrambled to my feet, put on my frock coat and lit a small lantern to discover the source of this commotion. I saw Mrs. Anstruther outside on her knees, crying hysterically in front of Lady Fitzalen's room. Before I could speak, I was quickly joined by the others, with Mortimer waving his gun around in sheer blind panic as he stared into the darkness and aimed the weapon at some invisible foe. And even Dodgson appeared in an anxious state. I immediately took control of the situation and shouted, In the name of God, everyone, please calm down, and Mrs. Anstruther, kindly explain what has happened. Raising the now gibbering and tear-stained woman to her feet, I said calmly, Pray, madam, tell me why you are so distressed. Still sobbing, she pointed her hand at the door. Oh my God, my Gerald, he... She then collapsed and passed out. I then took Mortimer's blunderbuss and ordered the coachman to carry her downstairs to the hall. There she recovered from the smelling salts I had brought from my room and seemed more lucid, but was still sobbing and speaking incoherently. However, I gathered the following from her responses. She claimed that Lady Fitzalen's door was unlocked, and her husband had decided to peep inside to see the fuss with Mr. Ambrose's warning. She claimed she implored him not to enter, but he did not think it was an issue. After swinging the door open and stepping inside with a candlestick, the door immediately closed behind him. Despite repeatedly calling out to him, there were no responses. The door remained firmly locked, and the room was silent. It was then that I appeared from my room. I sat her on a bench and sat astride, facing her directly. Staring into her eyes, I calmly said, Before we left the George in Colchester, I had an opportunity to glance at the passenger list. You both were shown as the Reverend and Mrs. Austin Anstruther, and now you say his name is Gerald. And what of the door? I checked it briefly before I went to sleep, and it was, as Mr. Ambrose had said, quite locked. So tell me, what was a cleric and his wife visiting Holland for? You certainly weren't going on holiday, as you only carried one piece of luggage each. I turned to Dodgson and asked him to bring their bags into the hall. I was sure these two were not the people they claimed to be, and for some undisclosed reason seemed rather in a great hurry to leave these shores. She quickly gathered her senses and attempted to pursue Dodgson, but was restrained by Mortimer. Dodgson returned with 2 still unpacked leather bags, which he placed on the ground before her. I said, Would you care to open these bags for inspection, or shall I take the honour? She suddenly regained her composure and aggressively replied, Go ahead, sir. and if you dare, I will sue you through the courts and take a pretty penny from you, for you have no legal right to do this." Dodgson opened both bags and out-tipped high-quality gold and silver jewellery, all studded with rubies, emeralds, sapphires and diamonds. I instantly recognised the most beautiful piece as stolen from a country house burglary a few months ago. Known as the Princess von Mecklenburg tiara, it was featured in the London Gazette with a substantial reward for its return. The haul from both bags included many loose rubies, sapphires, diamonds and emeralds, which had probably been ripped from other stolen items. Confronted with the evidence of some misdeeds, Mrs. Anstruther at last seemed resigned to her fate and admitted that her name was Imelda Stratton. She was a former governess for the Countess of Norwich, and as such travelled frequently across the country and abroad, entering many fine estates that contained wealth beyond most people's imagination. Being from an impoverished branch of the nobility, she was easily treated as a confidant by many wealthy houses, and from these confidences she knew what jewellery these people owned and, more often than not, where it was kept. Security among them was so poor that many fine items were kept in their bedrooms, in jewellery boxes or dressing table drawers. Her missing husband was a confidence trickster she met some years ago, often posing as a cleric. He was also skilled in the art of burglary, and having these abilities proved a good combination with her connections to the rich. She also admitted that she had recently left her post, and both were hoping to dispose of their acquired wealth to an unscrupulous precious stones dealer in Amsterdam. She was adamant that her partner, now admitted to be a Gerald Hinchcliffe, genuinely discovered the door to Lady Fitzalen's room unlocked, and that he could not resist looking inside when the door closed and locked him inside. With all that had happened today, I could not say I was shocked by conventional standards. It was too much to comprehend. Imelda, the jewellery and the mailboxes were placed under Mortimer's guard. He shackled her to the refectory table with manacles that were retained officially as part of his duty as a male guard. She was still bereft with the loss of her partner, and would no longer pose a threat to the three of us who were left. Of course, what were we to do about the missing man? Her story seemed improbable, but what if all she said was true? After all, she admitted to the jewellery theft, so why would she lie? Leaving Mortimer and his prisoner downstairs, we went to Lady Fitzalen's bedroom door. It was still very much locked, and despite repeatedly rapping the door, we could not elicit a response from within. Dodgson then, in frustration, tried forcing the door with his shoulder, but this door would not budge. It was built like all the doors in this house, which was made of English oak, and was at least an inch thick. As oak ages, a chemical process makes the wood more durable and substantially stronger. The door frame was of similar construction as the heavy door lock, which was hand-forged, and with time and age it was almost welded to the door and frame. Likewise, the hinges were of hand-forged strapwork similar to the lock. In short, it seemed impossible to open. It was now edging towards 3 a.m., and the heavy beat of a wall clock echoed much louder in the hall. An air of tension pervaded the property, and at this point I resolved to go to Mr. Ambrose's home to enlist his assistance, as Hinchcliffe had seemingly come to some harm in the room. But as I attempted to leave, the exit doors to the front and rear were firmly locked, as were the windows, which would not budge. In short, we were all trapped inside by some strange, nefarious force that had failed to identify itself. We removed 2 heavy medieval axes from a fixture above the fireplace that was still quite serviceable for my purpose. Firstly, I wanted to force an entry into Lady Fitzalen's room, as my immediate concern was the safety of Hinchcliffe. Then, I wanted to find a way of opening an external door to seek Ambrose. Having returned to Lady Fitzalen's door with Dodgson, I raised my axe to strike it. Quite unexpectedly, the door groaned as it gently swung partially open. We were caught entirely off guard and lowered our axes to assess the situation. Dodgson naturally appeared quite jittery, and nervously looked at me and then at the door, saying in a subdued voice, "Do you want to go in, sir, because whatever is in there indeed isn't Master Hinchcliffe?" Before answering him, I used the axe to push the door into the room, and the light from candlesticks showed a barren, empty small bedroom, devoid of any furniture or indeed the missing man. Fleetingly in the flickering light, I thought I saw a shadow dart across a shuttered window, but nothing, absolutely nothing whatsoever. It looked from large deposits of dust to have been empty for many a year. And faintly I observed what looked to be human footprints etched into the residue of dirt, and leading from the threshold of the door to the far right corner of the room, which appeared to have a partially open panel in the wainscoted walls. We decided to venture in after first summoning Mortimer to join us. Mortimer peered into the void, looked as shocked as us, and asked me, "What do you intend to do?" It was self-evident that none of us wanted to enter that accursed room, even less the open-panelled door. I requested Mortimer give me his blunderbuss and to jam the bedroom door frame with an axe to prevent its closure after we entered. Having agreed, I first entered slowly with the weapon, while Dodgson held a lit candelabra that brightened the room as we entered. The smell inside was that of old wood and something else, and although indefinable, it was foul and corrupt. Hesitatingly, we edged slowly towards the open panel from which emanated a gentle draught that defined the foul smell more starkly and self-evidently was evil. I could see that the panel was a secret door that opened to a flight of red brick steps spiralling down into the darkness. The walls were also of the same brick and were as old as the house. Again on the dusty steps, I saw the impressions of what looked to be Hinchcliffe's shoes leading down into the darkness. Crossing myself and saying a brief prayer, I led Dodgson deep down and beneath the house's foundations. The secret panel and steps suggested that we may be inside a staircase leading to a priest's hole, a place secretly built to hide Catholic priests who were avoiding persecution during Elizabeth I's reign. But what permeated the atmosphere in that room was less than holy, and the tension increased as we made our way down to what appeared to be a basement area. As we quietly emerged, we saw what appeared to be a rancid and rotten human corpse, busily indulged in eating the remains of Hinchcliffe. The only way I knew it was him was by the blood-soaked remains of his frock coat. This foul obscenity to God sounded like a starving animal as it ripped into what remained of Hinchcliffe. The creature that once appeared to have been female was too busy indulging in its meal to notice our presence, but as we stepped forward it looked into our light and screamed as if blinded by candlelight. The scream was chilling and reverberated around the chamber like some banshee from hell. Instinctively I fired the blunderbuss into its head, which caused it to stagger backwards momentarily, and then I grabbed the axe from Dodgson and swung its blade with such force that it severed the creature's head from its body. Whatever it was now quite dead, and now I resolved to speak to Ambrose if only this house would allow us out. Having returned with Dodgson to the warm confines of the hall, I broke the news to Imelda, who was racked with torment and grief. Leaving the others temporarily, I went to the rear kitchen door to discover it was unlocked, and I went outside. The weather had now changed, the snow was melting, and it started to rain. I went to Ambrose's home and raised him from his sleep. He appeared unhappy with my intrusion, but when I explained that a passenger had died, he asked me, "Has someone been into Lady Fitzalen's room?" I nodded grimly, and still dressed in a nightgown and cap. He invited me into a small but well-appointed lounge. Having lit some candelabra, he asked me to sit, and so I told him of the encounter and death of the creature. While listening intently, he shook his head and looked sad. He said, "I wasn't being entirely honest with you because Lady Fitzalen was, I suppose, technically alive." He explained that 5 years ago, while on a trip to Egypt, Lady Fitzalen was cursed by a fakir following a tomb excavation dispute. The fakir, as a member of an ancient Egyptian cult, claimed their spiritual leader, a high priest named Serapion, was buried there, and she was despoiling his tomb. She, of course, refused, and he uttered a curse on her that would turn her into a living corpse once she returned to England. She would, in his words, become a creature so vile she would lust for raw human and animal flesh, and be gifted with specific powers to ensnare her victims. Sure enough, a year later, she suddenly started to change, and the transition took her from a vibrant woman in her mid-50s into this despicable creature with a body of slowly rotting flesh, who was utterly inhuman. Her nephew briefly came over from Italy and paid body snatchers to remove a freshly interred woman's body of similar age from Colchester, and then substitute her body for Lady Fitzalen's. Her death was then officially announced, and the corpse was placed without due haste in her tomb. This facilitated her nephew's legal control of the estate as the sole beneficiary of her will. The living corpse of Lady Fitzalen was confined in the priest's hole, with access to the locked room, which had its windows barred and shuttered. Ambrose, her former butler, visited her daily, fed her raw animal meat, and ensured the door remained locked. However, with the powers granted by the Vicar, she evidently could remotely control the mechanisms of the doors and windows. To resolve this terrible situation, he agreed, as the controlling agent for the estate, to pay Imelda Stratton a generous yearly allowance to compensate her for losing her partner and to buy the coachman's silence. The others discussed this offer, and they agreed to the proposal. The stolen jewels were later anonymously passed to London's Bow Street runners, a policing authority, who returned them to their respective owners where possible. And there my story ends. Of course, we were able to continue our journey to Harwich, but due to the change in circumstances, none of us made it to the continent, with me, a lawyer, being delegated with the jewels' return. A footnote. I discovered recently that Fitzalen House had caught fire in mysterious circumstances following Ambrose's death. The entire property was reduced to brick and embers, and the land was cleared and sold to a local farmer. The end. Hilditch House, written and read by Christopher Halton. Sat brooding over a green and verdant valley of fine firs and sheltering rhododendrons lies Hilditch House, standing imperiously atop a stony Cumberland crag and staring down disdainfully from arched windows into a valley below. Built in the late 19th century, this four-bedroom house with tall funnelled chimneys, weathered stone walls and gargoyles aggressively guarding corners looks rather incongruous within its surroundings. This notion of architectural hostility is further emphasized by a large front porch with a huge black-painted door encasing space white rectangular glass door lights resembling a monster's teeth, adding further unease to the unwary visitor. The house had not received guests for many years, as its last owner took to the family with a meat cleaver, and at night wails and screams are sometimes heard on the wind being funneled through the surrounding hills and into the dark encapsulating forests. On a dark wintry night in 1947, George Malpass's Austin, Norfolk saloon spluttered and broke down on a winding valley road as he desperately tried to get to Carlisle, where a hotel room had been reserved. Driving through heavy gusting rain had been difficult enough, but in the end a broken fan belt triumphed over the fortitude of nature with its maelstrom from hell. He put on a raincoat and hat and looked desperately for any sign of human habitation in this unedifying, hostile environment. He was whipped hard by rain and wind, striking in waves as he searched desperately for shelter. Good fortune appeared when he saw lights from the gloom on the hill above the road. Approaching it quickly by a detritus-ridden track smeared with algaeic slime, he eventually arrived at the door of a sanctuary with its house lights beaming into the darkness. He rapped the heavy brass knocker hard, and very shortly it was answered by an elderly lady of small stature who appeared in her late 70s. She was neat and trim and had a warm, engaging smile below her small, round-framed glasses. "Come in, please," she implored, tugging the sleeve of his raincoat to emphasize the urgency of the situation. He duly followed her into a large, spacious Victorian-era hallway, where she took his hat and coat and placed them on the hooks of an ornate mahogany hall stand. The hall and the house were warm, brightly lit, and felt welcoming. By way of introduction, she said, "My name is Ellie, and I live here with my daughter, son-in-law, and their children. However, tonight I have the house to myself, as they are away for a while and will not be returning soon." She smiled, looked up at him and said, "Terrible night tonight, isn't it? How may I help you?" "My car broke down on the road and I must get to Carlisle tonight. Could I borrow your telephone to make a call? I am more than happy to pay the cost of it." She apologetically replied, "I wish I could help, but the wind took down my telephone wire. I'm afraid you are stuck here for at least tonight, but be rest assured I won't allow you to leave until morning, as I can let you sleep in my daughter's bedroom. I changed the bedding there, so it's nice and fresh, and you will feel comfortable. That I can guarantee." She paused, looked slightly confused, and continued, "Oh yes, before I forget, I have a friend nearby who you can get to in the morning, and he can run you into Carlisle." He thanked her and felt relieved. He may finally be able to meet his commitments, as his meeting is essential for his small engineering company in Preston, Lancashire, as he has arranged to meet with a prospective client from Scotland who has travelled down from Edinburgh. She then said, "The weather must be making you feel chilled. Let's go to the kitchen, and I'll make you a nice cup of tea while you relax next to the wood stove." With that, he followed her and sat in a Windsor chair beside the blazing warmth from the open stove door. Feeling happy at his change of fortune, he rubbed his hands excitedly against the heat. She then poured a large, refreshing cup of tea from a teapot resting atop the stove, and after adding milk and sugar to his requirements, he sat back and gently drank the amber liquid while looking around the kitchen. Although dated, the kitchen was well laid out and clean. It had a fine Westmoreland oak dresser neatly filled with blue and white china cups, saucers and plates. The Belfast sink looked immaculate, and the water was supplied from an old-fashioned hand pump that extracted clean and fresh water from an aquifer below. As Ellie busied herself in the kitchen and making small talk, he noticed she too was somewhat dated in her manner of clothing and looked more Edwardian than someone dressed for post-World War II Britain. But then again, quite a few grannies still dressed in the clothes of their youth and thought nothing more about it. He felt as though he was at home, and all seemed cosily familiar to his own family background. Whilst chatting, she spoke of her daughter Emily, her son-in-law Alfred, and her twin grandchildren Sarah and Thomas, aged 8. He asked where they were, and she told him they were visiting Alfred's relations and wouldn't return soon. She said she felt lonely on a terrible night like tonight, and she was grateful for company with such a lovely young man. He smiled, and then she lifted a cake dish lid on a pine kitchen table which contained a freshly baked ginger cake. "Would you care for a slice? Made it myself barely an hour ago." George was happy to try a slice, as he hadn't eaten for a few hours, and the journey getting here gave him quite an appetite. The cake was delicious when cut in a wedge and served on a small plate from the dresser. What a stroke of luck, he mused quietly, to meet such a lovely and agreeable lady. Feeling more at home and less of a house guest, George spoke of his family, his dear wife Margaret and his daughter Julie, whom he missed terribly. Ellie replied, "I understand fully. So are you away often, or is this a rare outing to Cumberland?" George looked rather glum when he replied that he was often away, as business was tight in the aftermath of war, and he was forever chasing new clients for his company and its 10 employees who relied on him for work. She looked somewhat miffed and said, "Don't you think your family comes first?" Surprised at her reaction, He put down his plate and replied emphatically, "If I didn't do this, Ellie, I wouldn't be able to support my family. I have little choice." Apologetically, she responded, "I am sorry if I sound harsh, but Alfred is like that, never at home and always away. The children are often sad when their father isn't here. He is a sales rep and travels a lot. My poor daughter." She broke off, changing the subject to life living in the Lake District, and once more she returned to her earlier self, asking if he wanted some ham and cheese sandwiches, as she saw the cake gave him an appetite. He thanked her, and that momentary spat passed very quickly. After eating, they retired to the front lounge, a well-maintained room filled with Victoriana. The centerpiece mahogany panel picture frame over the fireplace depicted a daguerreotype-like image of children and fairies playing in a glade. The fire surround was of an elegant cast-iron design, with flowery motifs scrolling around the supports and top. It was surmounted by a long, flat-panelled edge that displayed China Staffordshire figurines. With a roaring and welcoming hot coal fire in its grate, it felt more like a homecoming than a car breakdown. Nestling against the heavy Victorian drapes was a beautiful bonheur du jour writing desk and an elegant rococo chaise longue. George remarked on these items, and Ellie said they came from a country house sale at Derwent, which her father had bought many years ago. They chatted about the furnishings and fittings of the house, which George admired a lot. Ellie then got up and, from a drinks cabinet, gave him a brandy in a glass as a night tonic, which George drank. George soon felt sleepy and was ready for bed. Ellie took him upstairs to the master bedroom, which had a lit fire and a very comfortable bed. She said, "Sleep well, George, and don't worry about a thing." As she left the room, she turned towards him with a smile and bade him good night. She then gently closed the door, and George heard her on the staircase returning downstairs. He washed himself with a water jug and bowl set on a washstand, and having prepared himself, clambered into bed and soon fell asleep. George could not remember what time it was as he awoke in the night feeling dizzy and disorientated as though he had been drugged. His vision was blurry. In this state of torpor, he was sure he could see two children, a boy and a girl, staring at him from the foot of the bed in the weak light of a nightlight candle still burning on a side table. George, though, was unable to speak. He wanted to scream and move, but he could not do so. A woman joined them, and all three stared coldly at him before they faded into nothingness. Who or what were these people, he reasoned to himself? Delirium caused by his paralysis, or some mental malady caused by the stress of life? He was frightened and confused, but there was little he could do other than close his eyes, and with that his head spun and he passed out. Much later he awoke again, and it was still dark, although he could now hear a freshening wind blowing outside. He could hear the sway of the trees, intertwined with the now distinct dissonant cries of children screaming for their lives, and fleetingly the sound of a woman's scream. It was horrible to listen to, it was too much to bear, but he could still not speak, and this terror left him a simpering wreck. Although he now had some movement in his limbs, gaining strength from this was impossible. So despairingly he lay there waiting silently in the apprehension and sheer terror of what may happen next. Sweat was perspiring from his brow, and his body trembled with terror. After some minutes of silence, he heard the back door downstairs open and the sound of a body being dragged outside. These sounds repeated 2 times more, and then the door slammed shut. There was more silence, and there he lay for another hour, too terrified to sleep and still barely able to speak any utterances for help. George feared for Ellie, that kind old lady who had taken him in from the cold and given him food and a bed for the night. Perhaps she fled the house for help, or is a victim of a foul crime perpetrated against her. But who were the others, ghosts or themselves, victims of a maniacal killer? Then a dreadful thought occurred to him that he might be next. His breathing became shallow when he heard a heavy thump of feet on the staircase. Someone or something was making its way slowly up the stairs, and his heart pulsated loudly in his chest with a steady thump that grew louder and louder as finally the feet reached the floor of the wooden landing outside his door. Then, nothing. Whoever it was still stood outside that door and waiting in silence. Georges' imagination then vividly drew the imagery of some fearful blood-stained brute holding in his hand a bloodied knife still dripping blood from the bodies of his victims that now lay cold and silent outside. George struggled to get out of bed, but he could barely lift his head or even move the digits of his fingers. His body was heavy and unresponsive, and he knew that, save a miracle from God, he was going to die in this room, and probably end up later dragged out and perhaps buried outside in the woods with the others he heard earlier. Just then he heard a gentle tap on the bedroom door. It was Ellie. "Are you okay in there? I have just been outside to use the privy, and when I returned I thought I heard you having some terrible nightmare. Do you want me to come in?" George tried to speak again, but a loud mumbling was all that struggled to leave his mouth. It was loud enough, though, for Ellie to know that he was having difficulty. She opened the door and stepped inside with an oil lamp. She said, "I use the lamp to visit the outdoor lavatory at night, so don't be alarmed." George could see that she was still dressed, and her clothing had dirt and perhaps some stains on it. She stepped closer to the bed and, holding the lamp over him, said, "Everything will be all right, Alfred. Emily, Sarah and Thomas are here waiting for you outside. We are all back together now, and you will never ever have to leave home again." With that, a large meat cleaver was raised in her other hand, and with a smile it came crashing down into George's head. The following day, the road below Hilditch House was closed to traffic due to an accident caused by the bad weather. An Austin, Norfolk saloon had left the road on a sharp bend, crashed through a road sign, and plummeted into the woods. 2 officers from Cumberland and Westmoreland Constabulary were at the car waiting for an ambulance to remove the driver's body to Carlisle Hospital mortuary so that it could be officially declared deceased by a doctor. One officer said to the other, "This one is in a bloody mess. It looks like a road sign has sliced into his skull. Do we know who the driver was?" The other officer stared grimly at a driving licence in his hand and said, "It says here his name was George Malpas from Preston in Lancashire. I guess we best notify Preston to call his family to let them know, as someone from his family will have to attend the hospital to identify him officially." "My God," retorted the other, "this won't be a pretty sight. His head is virtually sliced in two. I'm glad I'm not the officer who has to share this." At that moment, an ambulance pulled in to park by the police car aside the road. Both officers then joined the ambulance crew, who then clambered down to retrieve Georges' corpse. The officers remained by the roadside while waiting for the body's removal and a tow truck to remove the wreck. One officer looked up and saw on the hill Hilditch House. Drawing the other officer's attention to it, he said, "Isn't that the house where all the murders occurred 25 years ago?" The other, lighting a pipe, replied after puffing on the bowl to draw an intense burn, "Yes, indeed. I was a young probationer when that happened. I'll never forget that so long as I live." The grandmother drugged her daughter, son-in-law and 2 grandchildren with a concoction of substances which paralysed them as they lay quietly in bed. She then took to their heads with a meat cleaver and tried to bury them outside, but the soil was too shallow, and the stench of their decaying bodies was later reported by a postman who discovered the corpses. He continued after another draw on his pipe. "Suffice it to say, the old woman was completely crazy and ended up in a mental hospital where she passed away 20 years ago. and yet when I saw her, she looked such a dear, kindly old lady. The other much younger officer interjected, "As a kid we were told the place is haunted. Just looking at it now gives me the creeps. No wonder nobody wants to buy or rent it." The pipe-puffing officer replied, "Funnily enough, thinking about the wound to the driver's head, it does look like he had been struck by a meat cleaver. What a strange old world." The end. The Black Library, written and read by Christopher Halton. Firstly, I am Peter Williams, and I want to share my incredible experience from 20 years ago when I decided to accept an invitation to travel to Cornwall. On a hot August day in 1930, I travelled down on the GWR line from London to spend a week at my Uncle Henry's 20,000-acre estate at Trevelyan Hall in Cornwall. The journey was rather hot and stuffy, necessitating the carriage windows to be pulled down to allow cooling air into my compartment. Fortunately, I had the space mainly to myself, which mitigated the possibility of other passengers complaining about the occasional ingress of an odoriferous mixture of tar-tainted steam and smoke from the chuffing and puffing engine as it buffeted against the occasional strong crosswind. Of course, this privacy allowed me to reflect warmly on childhood memories, and perhaps more negatively, the later inconsolable relationship between my late mother and her brother, my Uncle Henry, Lord Cuffmore of Trevelyan. I never did understand why this occurred, as they once seemed so close, and my mother never felt disposed to discuss these matters to any degree, but the rift lasted until her passing 5 years ago. I felt that now my uncle wanted to clear the air by inviting me back to reconcile past differences. As I arrived at Camborne, a small rural railway halt consisting of a single platform and a wooden brick and tile shelter, I was greeted by John Atkinson, my uncle's butler and confidant, who stepped out from a cloud of gushing steam as the engine breathed a weary sigh as it rested at the platform. Atkinson was a tallish fellow aged around 50 with a strong military bearing. He sadly walked with a slight limp, apparently due to shrapnel wounds received during his military service in World War I. He was of medium build and smartly dressed in a long-tailed navy blue pinstripe suit, resplendent over a white clerical collared shirt and a dark grey Windsor knotted tie. By his bearing and confidence, I could see that Atkinson had adapted well to this disability, and he came over and shook my hand excitedly. "Glad to see you again, sir," he gushed. "The last time we met you were barely 9 years old. Now look at you, the epitome of a fine country gentleman, I should say." Spotting a large Louis Vuitton steamer trunk being brought from the guard's van by 2 train staff, he instructed them to place it in the boot of a waiting Rolls-Royce saloon, which the chauffeur opened for them. Once placed inside, Atkinson closed the boot and tipped them before they gratefully doffed their hats and quickly returned to the departing train as it slowly pulled away to complete its ponderous journey at Penzance. Putting his hand on my shoulder, he ushered me to the waiting car, where I met the driver, who introduced himself as Wilkins. He was a trim, middle-aged man smartly dressed in a grey chauffeur's uniform, which consisted of a peaked hat, a double-breasted and button-collared jacket, jodhpur trousers and shiny leather riding boots. He opened the rear door and smiled, giving me an acknowledging salute as I clambered inside. Atkinson followed me before Wilkins closed the door and took us on to the estate where my uncle was waiting. During the journey, Atkinson mentioned that Lord Cuffmore was as excited as himself at my coming home, as he put it, and had matters to discuss once I was settled and unpacked in my room. Looking forward to meeting my uncle again, I sat back and relaxed as we weaved through a winding country lane bordered by acres of wheat fields and grazing meadows populated by sheep before eventually arriving at the house's main entrance some 10 minutes later. My uncle built the 20-bedroom palatial property some 20-odd years ago. On the surface it appeared late Georgian, but it was fitted with all modern amenities and constructed using modern steel girders sheathed with Portland stone. The girders held up a massive rotunda as a central focal point, whilst in front huge Doric columns supported a sheltering portico that allowed vehicles to stop and park while protecting passengers from the vagaries of English weather. After leaving the car, staff removed my case and moved it to a bedroom which had been prepared for me, while Atkinson escorted me to the rotunda, a massive library housing the fabled Cuffmore collection. As a child, I was never allowed into the library, and now I probably could understand why. Uncle had used his vast inherited wealth to amass a collection of rare books and manuscripts that would challenge any serious major collection. He had everything from ancient Egyptian papyrus to Shakespearean folios, and the entire collection was wonderfully indexed and catalogued on many divergent subjects. Within this vast space, they were ranked in their hundreds. I was quite breathless. As someone who loves ancient texts, this was akin to a Viking warrior of old entering Valhalla. My excitement was palpable, and smiling with nodding approval, Atkinson informed me that his lordship knew I would appreciate this collection, and he insisted that I be shown first before being received in the lounge. I answered that I was in awe of this treasure trove, especially as a practicing philologist with a BA in classics. I knew I could spend a lifetime exploring this material. He smiled, and with that we departed from the library, and he escorted me into the lounge where my uncle was sitting in a club chair reading a newspaper while clenching a monocle in his right eye. Henry was much older than when he last remembered him and seemed physically weaker due to his age. Rather overweight, he wore a Norfolk jacket, a collared white shirt, a brown tie, and a pair of baggy +4 trousers. Atkinson walked over to him and said, "Your lordship." Uncle Henry looked at me and said, "Hello, Peter. I'm jolly pleased to see you got here, eh, what?" With assistance from Atkinson, he got up and shook my hand before commenting, "By God, sir, you have certainly grown since I last saw you years ago. How the devil are you, young fellow?" I replied, smiling, "Fine, uncle, thank you, and all the better for seeing you." He then beckoned me to sit in an opposite club chair, and having reseated himself, said, "It has been many years since we last spoke, but I have been keeping an eye on you, and you may not know it, but I have been supporting you from afar with a trust fund in your mother's name after her death, which had provided you with financial support to see you through university. As a benefactor to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, I receive confidential reports on your progress, and indeed I am very impressed, which in part, dear boy, is why you are here today." He then explained that he and my mother had fallen out following an argument over my future. As the sole heir to the Cuffmore estate, for uncle never married, he wanted me to settle here with mother after father died in a freak accident in London. Still, she refused, preferring to keep me in London, as she enjoyed living a more independent life as a successful writer and having the company of her friends there. He admitted they had a blazing row over this, which is why I never returned in her lifetime. Everything he said made sense, and I was surprised he paid for a trust fund, as I assumed it was my mother who set this up. But I do also recall that she was an associate member of the Bloomsbury Group, an informal coterie of left-wing writers and intellectuals who led a rather hedonistic life with regular house parties and social gatherings, and I knew it was a financial drain for her to maintain this way of life after father passed. But naively, I did not give much thought to her living beyond her means. Anyway, I was satisfied with his explanation and pleased to be back with uncle, my only living relative. After catching up with the lost years we spent apart, he offered me the library as its curator, which I readily accepted. Many manuscripts and ancient works in the archives had not been fully appraised and researched, and he wanted me to complete this great work and, where possible, acquire more works from auctions and private sales. At the time, I lived in a modest apartment in Finsbury and immensely enjoyed my privacy. Transitioning to Trevelyan was a significant upheaval and lifestyle change I knew would be challenging, but the added offer of an apartment in the east wing of the house with splendid views across the countryside appealed to me, especially since working in the library was no more than a 10-minute walk through the house, so I agreed to his proposal to stay after returning to London to settle my affairs, and returned a month later with assistance from his staff. My uncle had unquestionably placed the trust of his collection at my disposal, and I was determined to make a go of it. With his permission, I engaged 5 recent graduates from Oxford and Cambridge as researchers and archivists working under my direct control. Surprisingly, I rarely met Uncle on my rounds, as the house was undeniably huge, with at least 100 staff members employed within the estate. Despite being in his early 80s, he was forever holding business meetings or facilitating academic researchers' use of the library's facilities. He owned or had interests in many companies ranging from banking to agriculture. He may have been physically infirm, but his mental acuity was as sharp as ever. This was the state of affairs for a few months until some odd things happened to me. At first, I thought I had heard a voice whispering in my ear at quiet moments, but I largely ignored this due to the human activity around me. Later, I thought I saw grey shadows cast on walls in the library or within the apartment, but I assumed this was my eyes playing up as I spent much time engrossed in reading or translating ancient text. This state of affairs continued for some months, when one night, while working alone in the library, I saw what I recognized as the figure of my late mother in a weak semi-translucent form which disappeared in the wink of my eye. She also appeared more visibly one morning as I awoke in my curtain-drawn bedroom, which was partially illuminated by light shining weakly through chinks in the curtaining. She looked sad, but appeared to briefly smile before fading away. I was again touched by her presence, which surprisingly did not disconcert me. I mused whether she was the source of the other anomalies that I had experienced, and although still in a tired state, I felt from her sadness that she was trying to tell me something was amiss. However, I tried logically to distance myself from these thoughts, which I felt were a byproduct of my tired imagination and the fact that I missed her greatly. After showering, dressing and eating breakfast, I returned to work in the library and continued the rest of the day without incident. This was the state of affairs for a few weeks. Nothing at all happened. But one late evening around 10 p.m, I thought my eyes were playing up when I saw what I thought was a bearded elderly man dressed in 16th century attire walk into the bookcase wall of the rotunda and disappear entirely from view. That was strange, to say the least. I immediately went to where he disappeared, thinking there might be a secret doorway, but there was nothing that I could find in the way of hidden catches or switches. Until that moment, I was sceptical about seeing my mother as a ghost. Having seen this fellow, I was now a believer simply because there was no logical alternative explanation. But I knew others would think I had lost my mind or was working with too much stress caused by my responsibilities, so I decided to say nothing. However, a picture was slowly emerging. I met my uncle weekly in the library to update him on progress reports, and he was affable as always with his warm, ruddy smile and thin-lipped moustache. Out of curiosity, I asked on such a visit whether he knew much about the site's history that the house was built on, as a nearby beautifully maintained knot garden surrounded by old red brick walls predated the current buildings. He smiled and said, "Well, yes, a small Elizabethan mansion existed here, built by an adherent of the teachings of John Dee, the alchemist who visited here often. I bought and demolished that house as it was beyond economic repair, and this present structure encompasses its foundations." It was claimed that Dee's library was stolen from his home in Mortlake, Surrey, before 1589, when he returned from Europe. Still, legend says it was brought here for safety, and the theft was merely a ruse to prevent his enemies from committing the crime. They say the collection held archaic books of great mystical power, including works from the lost Library of Babylon. But all that, unfortunately, is rumour, as I found no such works when I acquired the property. Can you imagine the knowledge that these books would have contained? Oh, Peter, we can all dream, eh? He smiled. I replied by adding, I have to say that having already perused a considerable number of ancient texts in this library, I found nothing pertaining to John Dee other than a copy of his mainstream 1570 work, Mathematical Preface to Henry Billingsley's English translation of Euclid's Elements. Thanking my uncle for the story, I paused to think of the historical significance that these ancient tomes once had. Little did I realize then how Dee's influence may have waned, but it had not gone away. My first inkling of suspicion was how coincidental it was that my uncle, a world-renowned collector of ancient books and manuscripts, should buy an empty, decrepit mansion that once may have contained a vast library of priceless books owned by one of history's notorious alchemists, John Dee, and that he would also incur the extra expense of demolishing the property when he could easily have built his house and estate on virgin land elsewhere. Dee's library, incidentally, was a regarded learning centre outside the universities, and it became the greatest in England and attracted many scholars. In fact, for its time, it was similar to my uncle's collection, but without these lost esoteric works. I decided to keep my suspicions to myself, and instead try to flesh out more background by speaking with Atkinson, his butler. That opportunity came the following day when he walked into the library while I translated some text from a recently acquired 9th century classical Hebrew parchment. Always smiling, he said, "Have some mail for you, sir, that arrived this morning," as he placed some letters from post-stamped academia on my desk. I thanked him and asked whether he was here when the Elizabethan property was purchased. He replied, "Indeed, sir, I was a personal valet then to his lordship and came over with him when he first arrived to inspect the house and estate. From memory, the previous owner, a retired priest, had recently died, and the house was structurally in a jolly mess, as it hadn't been maintained for years. I hoped he would have restored it, but as he explained then, he wanted to build a house with a vast library to house his collection, scattered across several properties he had owned, and felt this was the place to do it. Oddly enough, the house had its own library, but I never got to inspect it. I understand there weren't any books, and I can only assume the previous owner might have sold them as the house was still furnished. Why do you ask, sir?" "Oh, nothing really. Uncle Henry and I chatted about it earlier, and I was simply curious about the old house." He replied informatively, "Well, sir, where we are in the library was where part of the previous house stood. The old library was very much centred somewhere in this rotunda." After some small talk, he left after saying, "Your uncle is delighted with your work here. All credit to you, sir. You know where to find me if you need further advice or assistance." And with that, he was gone. I then visited the map room in the west wing, where I found a plan for the current property. I also found a cartographer's map prepared for the estate, which showed the original outline of the Elizabethan house, which had been meticulously measured and grid-marked, which allowed me to rescale the old house onto the current plan. And there I found an anomaly. From where the original library stood, there was an entrance to where that ghostly figure entered. Behind that bookcase was an empty cavity marked as a storeroom. I deduced that there was a hidden doorway from the bookcase into that room. Later that night, after all the others had gone to sleep, I went back into the library, armed with a torch, to see whether I could find the entrance. Uncle must have known this, so I decided not to share my discovery or suspicions with anyone. The one place I had not searched was the books themselves, which were late edition books that were not worthy of research and were unlikely to have been removed by any researcher. At first I pulled a few books out and returned them to the shelves, but without making any discovery. So instead I read the spines to see whether they would elicit a clue. Sure enough, after a few minutes, I found an autobiography by John Dee. I knew Dee had never written such a work, so I pulled it from the top of the spine. And to my amazement, I saw that the spine was, in fact, a hidden lever. The effect of that was a loud click. The bookcase swung out like a door and revealed a passageway built in old red brick, which led into what I perceived to be a dark, cavernous room that, under the light from my torch, revealed itself to be a library, and one full of many dusty old leather-bound books. Surprisingly, there was no electricity, just candles, and many of them. The smell was of musty old leather, and the air tingled with something dark, brooding, and patently mellifluous. I lit several candles and saw 2 ranks of bookcases in the middle, extending some 30 feet deep. Likewise, the walls were fitted with more bookcases running the same distance as the others, filled with ancient leather-bound books. I saw many of the book spines printed in gold block lettering in Latin, with others printed in Old French, German and Greek. I noted a few were copies of the Clavicula Salomonis, the Picatrix, the Arbitel de Magia Veterum, the Pseudomonarchia de Doem, and the Liber Juratus Honori, and so on and on. Fabled esoteric books and books that were so rare that the possibility of these few titles together in one place seemed impossible until now. But despite my piqued interest, the feeling of pervading evil was palpable. It was now apparent that this was John Dee's secret library and the reason for the construction of this estate. But why had Uncle lied to me? And then it dawned on me. These books must have given him great power, and in my mind I suspected a dalliance with Satan himself. The worst horror of this shocking discovery was a large pentagram painted on the old encaustic tiled floor. This was not just a library, but also a place of communion with the forces of evil. But what should I do? Just then I saw a flash of light from the entrance, and in the dim light that reflected off the walls, a human shape behind it. "Peter! Oh, Peter, why are you here?" a voice bellowed. It was Uncle. Taking stock of the situation, I replied to my uncle's voice. "This is why Mother broke contact with you, isn't it, Uncle?" The figure drew closer, and I saw it was indeed Uncle accompanied by Atkinson. Both men looked frightened and fearful of my discovery. Uncle then told me to quickly return to the library in the house, for it was unsafe. I followed them as we stepped back into the light of the now brightly lit rotunda. Closing the door to the secret library, he turned to me and said, "I owe you an explanation. Let us sit down." Both men were wearing dressing gowns and appeared very tired and somewhat apprehensive about my reaction. They took to a reader's desk and sat down, and Uncle ushered me to follow suit, which I did. To put it bluntly, I was angry and terrified of the secret library at the same time, and wanted an explanation. Pulling a pipe from his dressing gown pocket, he lit it with a match and inhaled the smoke before momentarily pausing to continue. "I wanted to tell you about this from the beginning, but as I can now see by your face, I was wrong not to tell you." He cleared his throat and continued. "Yes, I bought the old estate because of the library. The previous owner was indeed a priest of sorts, as he worshipped the forces of darkness and not God. I was truthful when I told you about Dee's library, but I was misleading you with the facts surrounding it. I am not a worshipper of evil, but a collector who believes these ancient books should be preserved for good or bad." He stopped, looked around the room and continued. "The collection is priceless, but as you can appreciate, I could not integrate these books with the rest of the collection, so I decided to incorporate this part of the original house with secret access being added. But," he paused, Unfortunately, your mother discovered the library for herself and claimed a confrontation with Dee in that room many years past, and also experienced its evil firsthand when she witnessed a gathering of souls trapped in that room and being drawn into the pentagram while Dee officiated in what she described as a ritual of evil. I believed her, as I had witnessed Dee's manifestation on 2 occasions there, and his spirit is very much active as he remains trapped as the guardian of his library. He continued, "The progenitor of all this evil is a copy of papyrus hieroglyphics entitled the Book of the Dead. Several extant examples survive from history, and they vary in spells and text according to the wishes of those to whom these books were dedicated and, on death, placed in their graves. The copy I am referring to was removed from the tomb of a high priest of an ancient Egyptian cult, which worshipped Sutekh or Set, the god of deserts, storms, disorder and violence. And it is this work that keeps Dee and others from returning to the spirit world. The copy in the library cannot be removed, nor can it be destroyed by fire or other physical means. And as much as I agreed with your dear mother, there was nothing I could say or do to rectify this, and as a result, she decided never to allow you and herself to return here. And that is that. You are my heir, and you have the academic tools of knowledge to end this nightmare." I sat quietly trying to take in everything he had told me. As incredulous as it seemed, I believed that the library was corrupted by evil and could, dare I think this, only be cleansed through an exorcism of ritual that would end this nightmare for once and all and send its encapsulated evil back to hell. I agreed to help Uncle and finally end this, but I needed a powerful book of rituals and spells to achieve this. Uncle, from memory, do you recall a little-known work called Dejectio Mali, published in the 16th century from the text of a 12th century scribe named Erasmus? It is written in Latin and contains incantations to exorcise powerful demons. The Church banned the original work, although I believe it has the power to rid this evil once and for all. Atkinson, who until then had sat quietly, remarked that he had seen it in the archives, and after having left for a few minutes, returned with a copy of a worn small leather-bound book, which he handed to me. After flicking through the pages, I discovered an incantation that Erasmus had recorded. It has been passed down the centuries by word from generation to generation and originated from Proto-Celtic paganism. But first we needed to prepare by collecting water, soil and a lit candle. We then had to administer the ritual by placing these items within the pentagram circle and standing within it while reading the incantation of cleansing. We did as instructed, and within the circle we could feel a heightening tension of what is best described as malevolent evil moving quickly around us. Without haste, I read an incantation that started as thus and continued for some minutes. Impero tibi diis ignis venti eris et accuse et terse et intra quorum divina sapientia et potestas. As I read, the room started to swirl around us physically. Like a cyclone, I saw grey, misty human forms swirling around us and gathering speed like water passing down a drain. Although we could feel this energy, the candle flame at our feet did not flicker. It was surprisingly silent, as I expected more, but after reading this incantation, it all suddenly stopped. The library and its contents remained, except for this feeling of evil and the now cremated Book of the Dead, which was reduced to ash and lay in a pile of a neighbouring aisle. The library was cleansed, and its now purified contents were removed to the rotunda, where they were registered under the esoteric section. From this moment onwards, I no longer saw the shade of my mother or that of Dee. Peace had finally been restored. My uncle lived on for a few more years before I inherited the estate and title and became Lord Cuthmore of Trevelyan. But I wanted no more of this tainted estate and later sold it to a business conglomerate for medical research. When I moved back to London, the library was donated to the Bodleian Library in its entirety. There I lived in a less spacious property with Atkinson, who served as my butler until his death in 1946. The end.